On the 6th of November, 1895, 2,000 people crowded into a church on Fifth Avenue to watch a girl of 18 marry a man she had met only a handful of times. Outside, mounted police held back crowds so large that traffic on the avenue stopped for hours. Inside, reporters counted the diamonds in the pews and sketched the wedding gown for the morning papers, describing the 15 feet of train, the Brussels lace veil, the orchids flown in for the occasion. Nobody wrote down what the bride's face actually looked like beneath that veil, because nobody was allowed close enough to see it properly. Her name was Consuelo Vanderbilt, and behind the lace, she was crying so hard that her voice barely carried through her own vows. The groom was an English duke, 23 years old, short, formal, and entirely unmoved by the woman standing beside him. The contract behind this marriage had already been drafted, reviewed and notarized by lawyers on both sides of the ocean, before either of them exchanged a single unscripted word at the altar. $2.5 million in railway stock changed hands the moment the ring went on her finger. A crumbling English palace, losing money every year for 2 decades, was about to be rebuilt with American money, and the mother, standing dry-eyed in the front pew, the one who had arranged every detail of this wedding, down to the last inch of lace, would one day tell a Vatican tribunal, under oath, exactly what she had done to make this day happen. "I forced my daughter to marry the Duke," she said. "I have always had absolute power over my daughter." That is where this story starts. It does not stay there. Consuelo Vanderbilt would spend the next 26 years married to a man who told her, more or less on their honeymoon, that he had never loved her and never would. She would watch her own fortune rebuild a palace she was never permitted to call home, while her husband's attention drifted toward another woman, quietly at first, and then not quietly at all. She would lose her jewelry, her privacy, and most of her 20s and 30s to a marriage she never chose and could not undo. And somehow, on the far side of all of it, she would come out more herself than the weeping girl at that altar had ever been allowed to be. This is her story, told the way she asked, eventually, to have it told. Good evening, and welcome. If the stories that bring you back here are the tragic marriages, the vanished fortunes, the women written out of the history their money quietly paid for, there is a subscribe button just below this video. It costs nothing to press it before we go on, and it means the next one of these finds you without you having to go looking for it yourself. Let us begin with her name, because even that was not entirely her own. Consuelo Vanderbilt was named after a woman almost nobody remembers today, a Cuban-American beauty called Consuelo Yznaga, who had crossed the Atlantic years earlier and married an English lord herself, becoming Duchess of Manchester before either of the Vanderbilts had ever set foot in a London drawing room. It was Yznaga who first showed young Alva Vanderbilt exactly how the game was played on the other side of the ocean, which doors could be charmed open and which ones could only be bought outright. Alva never forgot what she owed her. When her only daughter was born in 1877, she gave the child her friend's name, as if naming her for a woman who had already crossed successfully into the English aristocracy might somehow write the same outcome into the girl's future. It did, in the end, almost exactly. The daughter would live out her own version of the friend's story, on a far grander stage, at a far higher price. To understand how a mother could do to her own child what Alva Vanderbilt did, you first have to understand the war Alva had already fought, and won, years before Consuelo was even born. In 1883, the single most powerful woman in New York was not a Vanderbilt at all. She was Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, known to the entire city simply as Mrs. Astor, and she kept a list. 400 names, no more, because 400 was the number of guests who could fit comfortably inside her own ballroom. If your family was not on that list, you did not exist in any way that could be passed down to your children. The Vanderbilts, sitting on the largest fortune in American history, were not on it. Old New York looked at fresh railroad money the way a cathedral looks at a car dealership, with a kind of architectural contempt that no amount of cash seemed able to dissolve. Alva refused to accept the verdict. She built a French chateau on Fifth Avenue for $3 million, and then she threw a costume ball inside it, so extravagant that newspapers gave the evening entire pages. 1,200 guests, $11,000 spent on flowers alone. Champagne fountains that ran past midnight. Alva herself appeared as a Venetian princess, dripping in real jewels rather than paste ones, and the guest list that evening amounted to a walking catalogue of New York's actual money, whatever Mrs. Astor's own list still refused to admit. Reporters were stationed at the door simply to record what each guest wore, and the illustrated papers ran sketches of the costumes for weeks afterward, the way a modern magazine might run photographs from an awards ceremony. And one invitation that was never sent, to Mrs. Astor's own daughter, on the technicality that Mrs. Astor herself had never once formally called on Mrs. Vanderbilt. Protocol required the older woman to move first. Mrs. Astor's carriage arrived at the Vanderbilt mansion the very next afternoon. Her calling card went up on a silver tray. The invitation followed within the hour. Alva had just forced the most powerful woman in New York into the most expensive act of social surrender the city had ever seen, and she had learned something from the victory that she would apply, without a shred of mercy, to her only daughter a decade later. Money, applied with enough precision, could break down any door in America. There was, however, a ceiling even the Vanderbilt fortune could never quite bypass, because in New York you could never entirely stop being new money. Across the ocean, there existed a currency that outranked cash altogether, a title, the genuine kind, backed by centuries and a seat in the House of Lords. By the early 1890s, this had become an industry with its own reference book. A volume called Titled Americans sat in New York shops and on Fifth Avenue side tables, listing every eligible European nobleman by rank, by estate, by income, by outstanding debt, and by current marital status, with the clinical thoroughness of a livestock catalogue. The demand on the American side was easy to explain. There were more than 4,000 American millionaires by 1890, and not one hereditary title among them. The supply on the English side was just as easy to explain, for the opposite reason. Cheap imported grain had gutted British land rents for 2 decades running, and the great estates that had sustained the aristocracy since the 17th century were quietly, steadily going broke. The Duke of Marlborough's own palace was losing money every single year by the time Alva went looking for a match. Between 1870 and 1914, 454 American heiresses crossed the Atlantic and married into that fading aristocracy. Converted into today's money, their combined dowries and settlements would run past $4 billion. 9 of those women became duchesses, 33 became countesses. This was never romance dressed up in silk and orange blossom. It was a transaction, drawn up by attorneys, scheduled like bond coupons, and settled to the dollar before either party had exchanged so much as a formal introduction. The machinery behind this transaction had its own annual calendar, and American mothers learned to read it the way their husbands read a railroad timetable. Each spring, the London season opened, and with it came the ritual of presentation at the Court of St. James, where a young woman curtsied before the reigning queen as proof that she had officially arrived in society at the highest possible level. A single presentation could cost thousands of dollars once the gown, the ostrich plumes, the regulation length of train, and the weeks of subsequent social calls were all counted. Mothers rented houses in Mayfair for the season. They hired social secretaries whose entire job was knowing which drawing rooms mattered and which invitations could safely be ignored. It was into this exact machinery, calendar and all, that Alva Vanderbilt inserted her own daughter, with the same precision she had once used to force open Mrs. Astor's ballroom. Consuelo would not even be the only bride in her own circle living out this exact arithmetic. Mary Leiter, the daughter of a Chicago department store fortune, married Lord Curzon that same decade and eventually became Viceroy of India, her father's money quietly underwriting a political career the Curzon estate alone could never have financed. May Goelet, whose family had built a fortune in New York real estate, married the 8th Duke of Roxburgh a few years later, and her dowry rebuilt Flore's Castle in Scotland stone by stone, saving it from the exact slow ruin that had nearly swallowed Blenheim. Different houses, different dukes, the same underlying transaction repeated across an entire generation of American daughters. Consuelo Vanderbilt was simply the one whose wedding happened to be the loudest, and whose mother happened to be the most determined to see it through to the altar, no matter what her daughter actually wanted. Not every one of these daughters accepted the arrangement quietly once the ring was on her finger. Anna Gould, the youngest child of the railroad financier Jay Gould, crossed to France a few years after Consuelo crossed to England and married a count named Boney de Castellane, a man who spent roughly 2/3 of her enormous inheritance on himself while mocking her openly in front of their own guests. Where Consuelo endured, Anna eventually refused to. She cut off her husband's money entirely, sent his clothes back to his family, and later married his own cousin, a duke, in what society at the time understood perfectly well as a calculated act of revenge. It is worth remembering, sitting inside Consuelo's own story, that at least one of these arranged marriages produced a woman who fought back in exactly that way. Consuelo's own rebellion, when it finally came, would look nothing like Anna Gould's. It would take much longer, and it would look far less like victory and far more like simple survival. By 1894, Alva had already chosen her daughter's future husband, and she had spent years quietly preparing the product for market. Long before Consuelo Vanderbilt was ever sold to a duke, her mother strapped a steel rod into a corset-like brace and made the girl wear it during lessons, at meals, through hour after hour of instruction in French, in music, and in the family trees of the English nobility. It was not punishment, Alva reportedly told her. It was preparation. The girl was not allowed to choose her own dresses. Her letters were read before they were sent. Her friendships were screened for anyone who might plant an independent thought in her head. A riding crop sat within view during lessons, rarely used, always visible, which was rather the entire point of keeping it there. Consuelo grew up inside a Fifth Avenue mansion staffed by dozens of servants and filled with the finest art and tutors money could buy, and by every measure that actually mattered to a child, she was a prisoner inside it. She would later describe her own girlhood, in prose so precise it still lands like a diagnosis, as a childhood of magnificent loneliness. She had nearly everything a girl of her era could be taught to want, and she was permitted almost none of the one thing every child actually needs, which is the freedom to become someone of her own choosing. At 17, inside that same gilded cage, Consuelo fell in love anyway, the way young people trapped in impossible situations sometimes still manage to do. His name was Winthrop Rutherfurd, an American, charming, well-liked, tall enough to be noticed across a crowded room, and wholly unsuitable to Alva's actual plans, precisely because he carried no title behind his name. By Consuelo's own later account, there was a real understanding between them, private and hopeful, the sort of quiet arrangement two teenagers make when they believe, wrongly, that their own wishes might still count for something in the end. When Alva discovered the attachment, she moved the way a general closes a breach in the line. Consuelo was pulled out of New York society entirely and shipped to Europe, watched constantly, cut off from her own letters, while her mother finalized terms with a 23-year-old English duke named Charles Spencer-Churchill. There was no negotiation on Consuelo's side of that decision, no appeal, no room left for a girl's own preference to weigh against a mother's arithmetic. The Duke needed money far more urgently than he needed a wife, and Blenheim Palace needed it more urgently still. The negotiations moved like a corporate merger, because in every meaningful sense that is exactly what they were. $2.5 million in Beech Creek railway stock, transferred to the Duke on the day of the ceremony. An additional guaranteed income of $100,000 every year, on top of the initial settlement. Over the years that followed, the Vanderbilt family would funnel roughly $20 million in total into the Marlborough household, a sum that would exceed $300 million in today's terms. Consuelo was not present for a single one of these conversations. Her preferences were never solicited, because her preferences had never once been the actual point of the transaction. The moment everyone who was there would remember for the rest of their lives came in a bedroom on the upper floor of the Vanderbilt mansion, in the final days before the wedding. Alva told her daughter that if she refused to marry the Duke, the shock of it would kill her outright, and that her own death would be entirely Consuelo's doing. Some accounts describe a doctor being brought in to confirm the diagnosis, though whether that doctor was genuine or simply invented for effect has never been settled by historians. What is settled is what happened next in that room, Consuelo agreed. The weeks that followed passed for her in a blur of fittings and rehearsals, every detail chosen by her mother, the bride contributing nothing to her own wedding beyond her body and her compliance. And so we return to where this story began, to Fifth Avenue on the 6th of November, to the veiled 18-year-old crying through vows she had never once wanted to make. On the honeymoon that followed, the Duke informed his new wife, without much preamble, that he despised anything that was not British. It was not a passing observation about taste, it was a declaration that the transaction had closed and that her value, as far as he was concerned, had already been spent in full. She had wept at the altar without knowing the half of what that title was actually going to cost her over the next quarter century. She was about to find out inside the coldest house in England. Everything that had happened to her up to this point, the brace, the locked room, the wedding itself, had at least happened in the open, in front of witnesses, in a city that watched every detail and wrote it down. What came next would happen behind closed doors, in a country where nobody was writing anything down at all, and where the woman at the center of it had no family nearby to notice if something had gone quietly, badly wrong. Before we go there, a quick word. If forgotten history like this, the women behind the fortunes and the palaces, is the reason you keep coming back, take a moment right now to like this video and drop a comment naming which duchess or heiress deserves her own hour next. It helps a story like this one reach the next person who needs to hear it, and every single comment gets read. Blenheim Palace had 187 rooms, and Consuelo would later say that not one of them ever felt like home to her. She arrived at the estate in the winter following her wedding, to find a house built in the early 1700s as a royal gift, spread across nearly 200,000 square feet, set inside 2,000 acres of grounds, laid out by Capability Brown. From the outside, it looked like a small city, with ideas above its station. Inside, it had no central heating whatsoever. The corridors stretched long enough that walking from one wing to another was a genuine journey measured in minutes rather than steps. Consuelo, raised in the overheated comfort of a New York mansion, took to wearing furs indoors through the winter months. Food arrived lukewarm because the kitchen sat so far from the dining room, carried across distances that no amount of hurrying by the household staff could ever quite close. Meals followed a fixed order that never varied by season or by mood. Dinner was announced by a gong. Guests dressed formally even on evenings with no guests at all. A household of several dozen servants moved through the house on schedules Consuelo had no say in setting, following protocols that had been fixed in place since her husband's great-grandfather's era. The new Duchess was expected to learn every one of those protocols to the letter. She was never once expected to change a single one of them, and nobody at Blenheim seemed to consider that arrangement in any way unusual. Her mother-in-law made the terms of the arrangement clear within days of her arrival. The first duty of any duchess, the Dowager Duchess told her plainly, was to produce a male heir, and this was delivered as a command rather than a suggestion. Without a direct heir, the title would eventually pass to a junior branch of the family, a branch that already contained one very ambitious young relative named Winston Churchill, whom the Marlborough women were determined to keep away from the family inheritance at any cost. Consuelo understood the message without needing to hear it twice. She had not married into a family in any sense she recognized. She had been purchased by an institution, and inside that institution her function was strictly reproductive. Her intelligence, her warmth, the very American vivacity that had once lit up a New York ballroom counted for nothing at Blenheim. If anything, they were considered mildly inconvenient. There is a small irony worth pausing on here, because the very man the Marlborough women feared as a rival became one of the few people inside that family who ever treated Consuelo as something more than a fortune with a wedding ring on it. Winston Churchill was her husband's first cousin, and he had actually stood beside the Duke as a supporter at the wedding itself, a young man not yet 30 and years away from any political fame of his own. He and Consuelo grew genuinely fond of each other over the following decades, corresponding and dining together long after her marriage to his cousin had collapsed and long after she had remarried a Frenchman entirely outside the family. It was, in its own quiet way, the one relationship inside that entire English dynasty that had nothing at all to do with money, dowries, or the succession the rest of the family had been so anxious to protect from him. The wider English aristocracy offered her almost no comfort in any of this. To most of her husband's circle, Consuelo was gratefully accepted for her money and quietly looked down upon for where that money had come from. American manners were considered loud. American confidence was considered vulgar. American cash, somehow, was never considered vulgar at all, so long as it kept arriving on schedule and kept the roof over Blenheim intact. Consuelo learned early on to keep her actual feelings in rooms where nobody else could see them, smiling at the shooting parties and the weekend gatherings where the cream of English society ate food her money had paid for, and quietly remarked on how American the whole arrangement felt. She did what was asked of her regardless. Her first son, John, arrived in 1897, barely 2 years after the wedding, and would grow up to become the 10th Duke of Marlborough in his own right. A second son, Alva, followed the year after that. The dynasty had been secured on schedule. Both boys grew up inside a household where their parents were increasingly polite strangers to each other, raised largely by nursemaids and tutors, while their father treated fatherhood itself as a duty best delegated to staff. Alva would live a quieter life in his older brother's shadow. Both men carried, for the rest of their own lives, the particular weight of having grown up as the visible proof that their parents' marriage had at least accomplished its one contractual purpose, even as everything else about it had plainly failed. Consuelo herself found something in those early years of motherhood that Blenheim had not yet managed to take from her. Whatever else the marriage had cost, she loved her sons plainly and without performance, in a house where almost everything else about her was performance. She read to them herself, rather than leaving the task entirely to nursery staff. She walked them through the gardens Capability Brown had designed for a different century, past the lake and the long avenues of trees, on afternoons when the great house behind them felt more like a monument than a home. It was, by her own later account, the one part of those years she never once regretted. The marriage itself, meanwhile, had settled into something closer to a vast and ornate desert. The Duke remained formal in public, and colder still in private, spending Vanderbilt money the way a man spends what he has never once had to earn for himself, because he never had. Millions poured into restoring rooms that had sat untouched for 2 generations. He rebuilt the water terraces, he acquired paintings, He bought jewels, including a set of pearls reportedly once worn by Catherine the Great, purchases financed by the very fortune that had bought him a wife he could barely be bothered to speak to over dinner. Consuelo sat every evening at the far end of a table built for state occasions, 15 feet of polished oak between her and her husband, a silence that no quantity of crystal or candlelight could ever quite fill. She had a household staffed by dozens. She did not have a single companion inside that entire vast building who was truly her own. Somewhere in the middle of all this, in 1905, the family commissioned the painter John Singer Sargent to produce a grand formal portrait of the Marlboroughs together, the Duke, Consuelo, and their 2 young sons, arranged beneath a painted classical arch inside Blenheim itself. It remains one of Sargent's most admired works, and it still hangs at the palace today, exactly where it was intended to hang, a picture of dynastic harmony commissioned at the precise moment the marriage behind it had already been quietly dead for years. Visitors who stand in front of it now are looking at a masterpiece, and without knowing it, at one of the most convincing lies ever committed to canvas. Consuelo herself, dressed in ivory satin, gazes out of the painting with the same composed, unreadable expression the newspapers had once mistaken for contentment. In public, the performance continued without interruption. Consuelo was presented at the court of St. James in the gown and plumes the occasion required, curtsying to a queen who had never once curtsied to anyone in her own life. She stood beside her husband at county functions and royal garden parties, photographed as the picture of a successful transatlantic match, the very outcome her mother had spent a fortune engineering. Newspapers on both sides of the ocean printed admiring descriptions of the young Duchess's poise and her famously elegant carriage, the very posture the steel brace had spent years drilling into her spine. Nobody watching from a distance had any reason to suspect that the marriage behind the poise had already gone cold within its first year. Consuelo had learned the lesson her mother taught her better than her mother probably intended. She had learned exactly how to keep private suffering completely invisible in public. Her letters home told the same practice story. She wrote to friends and family in New York describing the gardens, the shooting parties, the general splendor of a life that looked, on paper, like everything a girl of her upbringing was supposed to want. There is a particular loneliness in composing cheerful letters about a marriage that is quietly dying, choosing each sentence with the same care her mother once used to choose her dresses, aware that whatever she admitted on the page might travel back across the ocean and become gossip before the ink had properly dried. She had spent a childhood learning to be watched. Now she spent her marriage learning to be read, and she wrote accordingly, revealing exactly as much as safety allowed, and not one word more. Her childhood explained a great deal of what came later, though almost nobody at Blenheim would have known it at the time. Her parents' marriage had ended in scandal years before Gladys ever set foot in England, her father discovering his wife with another man in the south of France and shooting him in a jealous rage that made headlines on both sides of the Atlantic. He was tried and acquitted, but the killing broke something in him permanently, and he spent his final years confined, dying in an asylum in 1901 with his reason entirely gone. Gladys and her sisters had spent their childhood being fought over and carried between 2 parents who had stopped loving each other and started using their daughters as weapons instead. Each one a small hostage in a war that never really ended. She learned early, in other words, that love could end in violence, that the adults meant to protect her would instead bargain over her, and that almost nothing in her world could actually be relied upon to stay. Out of that instability came the fixed, specific ambition that would define the rest of her life. She wanted one thing that could never be taken from her by anybody's whim: a title, a house, a place secured by law rather than by anyone's changeable affection. She had settled on Blenheim and on the Duke who owned it before she had even turned 15. It was into this exact silence, sometime in the late 1890s, that this same Gladys Deacon first walked through Blenheim's doors as the Duke's invited guest. She was American by blood and had been raised largely in Paris, and by nearly every account left behind by the men who met her, she was close to impossible to look away from. Marcel Proust would later write that he had never in his life encountered a girl with such beauty paired with such intelligence. The sculptor Rodin sought her out as a friend. The painter Boldini set her upon his canvas. A future king of Prussia, by one well-documented account, gave her a ring serious enough to alarm his own father back in Berlin. She was, by every measure Europe's salons could offer, considered close to perfect, and it was precisely that word, perfect, that would eventually undo her. Convinced that her own nose fell just short of the classical line she admired in ancient statues, she had paraffin wax injected beneath the skin to straighten it, a fashionable and entirely untested procedure in that era. The wax did not stay where the doctors of the day promised it would. Over the following years, it slowly migrated downward through her face, and the beauty that had undone Proust began, quietly and irreversibly, to thicken and sag. She kept moving through the same brilliant rooms regardless, refusing to retreat from a world that had once found her impossible to look away from. She arrived at Blenheim, at first, simply as Consuelo's friend, and for a while, the friendship looked genuine on both sides. Two clever, restless American women, each trapped in her own way, inside the same cold English palace, found something like real companionship in each other, comparing notes, perhaps, on exactly how strange it was to be admired for a fortune or a face rather than for anything underneath either one. But Gladys Deacon had privately decided, at the age of 14, that she was going to be the Duchess of Marlborough one day, and the small fact that the position already belonged to a woman she liked had never once troubled that plan. As Consuelo's marriage went on quietly dying through the early 1900s, Gladys remained close by, patient, brilliant, and impossible to simply dismiss from the household, gradually becoming something to the Duke that his own wife had never once managed to be. In time, she became his mistress in every sense but the paperwork, and the friendship that had first opened Blenheim's doors to her turned out to have carried a very specific purpose from the very beginning. Meanwhile, the fortune that should have secured Consuelo's own future, the very money she had been sold across an ocean to provide, kept flowing outward regardless of who it was actually protecting. It funded the house. It funded the art and the pearls and the entertaining. It funded, indirectly, and then not so indirectly, a household that increasingly had room in it for another woman in everything but her legal title. The cruelest detail of all is the simplest one. Nearly everything inside Blenheim that glittered, the jewels the Duke acquired, the pearls once said to have belonged to Catherine the Great, the very ring on Consuelo's own finger, existed only because Vanderbilt money had paid for it. And piece by piece, as the marriage hollowed out, that same wealth kept being spent in directions that had nothing to do with the wife who had brought it across the ocean in the first place. Gifts flowed toward the household the Duke actually wanted. Dinners were hosted for the company he actually preferred. And Consuelo, who had financed the entire operation with her own dowry, was left to watch her own fortune underwrite her replacement in everything but name. She had paid, quite literally, for the palace she was living in. She was left to watch another woman slowly inherit the marriage taking place inside its walls. By 1906, after more than a decade of this arrangement, Consuelo and the Duke separated formally, and she took a house of her own in London. For the first time since she was 17 years old, she began building a life that belonged entirely to her, rather than to her mother or her husband's title. She threw herself into causes nobody had ever once asked her opinion about before. She founded hostels for young working women who otherwise had nowhere safe to live in the city, women who had come to London for factory or shop work and had nowhere respectable to sleep once the day's wages ran out. She supported medical charities serving London's poorest neighbourhoods, sat on committees that actually met and actually decided things, rather than existing purely for the social credit of being seen on the letterhead, and involved herself directly in early efforts to improve housing conditions for the working poor, a subject about which the wife of an English duke was not typically expected to hold, let alone voice, any strong opinion at all. She became, by nearly every account from that period, genuinely skilled at this work, and visibly happier doing it than she had been through a full decade of formal dinners at Blenheim. It was not the life her mother had purchased for her at such enormous cost. For the first time, it was a life she had actually chosen. It would still be 15 more years before that separation became an actual divorce. And the gap tells its own story about exactly what these marriages cost a woman who wanted out of one. Divorce in Edwardian England was not simply a legal proceeding. It was a social sentence. A divorced duchess lost invitations, lost standing, and handed her own children a stigma that followed them for the rest of their lives, regardless of whose fault the marriage's collapse had actually been. Families who had spent millions purchasing a title for their daughters had every financial incentive to keep her married on paper long after the marriage itself had died in every other sense, because an annulled or divorced title was, in the brutal calculus of the era, a title with the value quietly drained out of it. Consuelo waited. She built her London life, her hostels, her medical charities, and her own quiet independence, while the actual legal end of her marriage crept forward at the pace English law and English shame allowed it to move. Her own mother, in the meantime, had begun a slow and strange reckoning with what she had done. Alva had remarried following her own divorce and thrown herself into the suffrage movement with the exact same ferocious will she had once used to break into Mrs. Astor's ballroom. In 1926, more than 3 decades after that wedding on Fifth Avenue, Alva appeared before a Vatican tribunal to support her daughter's petition for a formal annulment. The Catholic Church required proof that the original marriage had been coerced. Alva gave that proof without flinching. She described the locked room in detail. She described the threats she had made against her own life. She stated, under oath, that she had forced her daughter into the marriage, and that she had always held absolute power over her. It is one of the most complete confessions of maternal coercion in the entire historical record of that era, delivered voluntarily by the very mother who had orchestrated the coercion in the first place. The annulment was granted. Afterward, Alva bought a house near where her daughter had settled in France, and spent her final years living close to the child she had once controlled, down to the last hour of every single day. It was not quite forgiveness. It was something more complicated than that, arrived at very late in both of their lives, with very little time remaining to actually spend it. There is a genuine contradiction sitting at the center of Alva Vanderbilt's later years, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, rather than rushing past it. The same woman who had locked her own daughter in a bedroom until she agreed to marry a man she did not love, spent much of her later life fighting, loudly and expensively, for women's right to vote. She funded suffrage marches. She opened her own homes to organizers. She argued, in public and often, that women deserved control over their own lives. Biographers have never fully agreed on how to reconcile the two halves of that story: the mother who stole her daughter's choice, and the activist who fought for every other woman's right to make her own. Perhaps it was simple hypocrisy. Perhaps, having watched exactly what the absence of that choice did to Consuelo, Alva came to understand the cost of what she had done more completely than she ever admitted aloud. Both things can be true of the same woman. Consuelo, who had every reason in the world to walk away from her mother entirely, chose instead to sit with her at the end, which is perhaps its own kind of answer to the question. Alva died in 1933, at the age of 80. Her funeral drew suffragists and socialites in roughly equal number, and her daughter stood among the mourners, 55 years old by then, having spent her entire adult life navigating the wreckage of one woman's ambition. 12 years earlier, on the 4th of July 1921, Consuelo had signed her divorce papers, and that same year she married a man who had loved her quietly since the night of her own debut, 26 years before. His name was Jacques Balsan, a French aviator of independent means, who had first noticed her as a teenager at a society event in the 1890s, and had simply waited, without pressing his case, through every year of her marriage that followed. He was not a duke, and he did not need her money, which alone set him apart from nearly every man who had ever formally courted her. He flew balloons and early airplanes as a genuine pioneer of French aviation. He served his country through the First World War, while Consuelo, still technically a duchess, ran her own hospital for wounded soldiers rather than sit out the war behind Blenheim's walls. She converted part of her own household into a working ward, arranged nursing staff, and by several accounts spent long hours at the bedsides herself, rather than treating the effort as a fashionable committee she could simply fund from a distance. The French government later recognized that wartime work formally, a recognition that had nothing whatsoever to do with a dowry or a title, the first honor of her adult life that was entirely her own. And when word of her separation from the Duke finally became public, Jacques did not rush her. He simply remained close by, patient in a way no one in her life had ever been patient with her before, ready the exact moment she was finally free to hear what he had wanted to say for 26 years. The wedding itself was small and private, nothing at all like the spectacle at St. Thomas Church 26 years earlier. Consuelo was 44 years old. For the first time in her adult life, she had chosen the man standing across from her, and by every account left behind by people who knew them, the marriage was simply, quietly happy, in a way that nothing before it had ever once been allowed to be. There is a strange and almost unbearable irony sitting just behind all of this, and it deserves to be told in full. Later that same year, once Consuelo's divorce had been finalized, the Duke of Marlborough finally married Gladys Deacon, the woman he had loved for the better part of 2 decades, the same woman who had waited 26 years, by her own private accounting, for exactly this outcome. She got the title, she got the palace. In the early years of that marriage, she filled Blenheim with a circle every bit as glittering as the one she had commanded in her youth, the writer Lytton Strachey among the guests, the hostess Lady Ottoline Morell among them too, drawn by the same restless brilliance that had once undone Proust. It must have felt, for a brief season, like exactly the life she had spent 26 years chasing. She had her own eyes painted directly onto Blenheim's ceiling by a commissioned artist, and her own face carved into a pair of stone sphinxes out in the garden, determined to press herself permanently into a house she had chased since childhood. And within a few short years, that marriage curdled into something every bit as cold as the one it had replaced. There were 3 miscarriages in 4 years, closing the door on children for good. Gladys filled the vast, echoing rooms with dogs instead, breeding spaniels that ran loose across priceless floors until the Duke was driven half to distraction by the smell of them. She kept a revolver at her own dinner table, and when a nervous guest finally asked what it was for, she is said to have answered lightly that she might simply see a rat she wanted to shoot. By 1933, the same Duke who had once poured Vanderbilt money into restoring Blenheim had the gas and the electricity to the palace cut off, room by room, purely to force his second wife out of a house she had every legal right to occupy. She left. He died the following year, before any formal divorce could be finalized, which meant Gladys kept the title to the very end of her long life and lost absolutely everything that was supposed to come with it. Consuelo had escaped that house and found something real waiting on the other side of it. Gladys won the exact thing she had wanted for 26 straight years, and it left her, in the end, holding a crown with nothing left underneath it. 2 American women wanted the same title for entirely different reasons, one because her mother demanded it of her, the other because she had chased it since she was 14 years old, and the house treated both of them, in the end, with the same cold indifference. The palace never cared which woman occupied the title. It only ever cared about being paid for. In 1953, Consuelo Vanderbilt Balson published a memoir called The Glitter and the Gold, and the title alone told readers everything the book was about to argue. Glitter was the surface, the titles and the jewels and the palaces built specifically to dazzle onlookers. Gold was the money underneath all of it, quietly paying for every ounce of that glitter without ever once being asked what it actually wanted in return. The book described the steel brace in plain, unsentimental language. It described the locked room, and the tears at the altar, and the cold house that followed both of them for decades. It was written in prose that was calm, precise, and quietly devastating in exactly the places that mattered most. Reviewers of the time were struck by how little self-pity the book actually contained, given everything it described. Consuelo was 76 years old when it was published, decades removed from the events themselves, and she wrote about her own youth with something closer to clear-eyed distance than lingering bitterness, which many readers found more unsettling than outrage would have been. She had been traded once, by contract and by force, from one family to another, her body and her fortune treated as interchangeable line items in the same transaction. By finally writing the story in her own words, she took the narrative back for good. She was no longer only the weeping bride the newspapers had described from a careful, respectful distance. She was the author of her own account, and hundreds of women who had lived some version of the same story, most of whom left no written record of their own at all, finally had someone speaking plainly on their behalf. The book found an eager readership and has never really gone out of print since. Edith Wharton, who had known Consuelo socially for decades, spent years working on her own novel about American heiresses crossing the Atlantic for English titles, a book she left unfinished at her death, and which was later completed by another writer and adapted, generations afterward, into a television series that still finds new audiences today. The appetite for this story, it turns out, never actually went away. Every generation since Consuelo's has rediscovered some version of the same arrangement, a woman's fortune traded for a man's name, and has been quietly startled to learn that the glossiest version on screen was, underneath the costumes, close to exactly true. Consuelo Vanderbilt Balson died on the 6th of December 1964, at the age of 87. She had outlived her mother by more than 30 years. She had outlived the Duke of Marlborough by 3 full decades. Blenheim Palace still stands today, a UNESCO World Heritage Site visited by hundreds of thousands of people every single year, and it stands, in no small part, because a weeping 18-year-old from Fifth Avenue paid for its survival with the better part of her own youth. She was hardly the only one. Floors Castle still stands because of May Golet's money. Whole wings of English country houses that now sell tickets and cream teas to tourists were quietly rebuilt, floor by floor, by fortunes that crossed the Atlantic, attached to daughters nobody thought to consult. The guidebooks at Blenheim mention the architects. They mention Winston Churchill, born inside those very walls. They do not always mention the woman whose fortune actually kept the roof standing over all of it. She was sold as a girl of 18, in a transaction she never asked for and could not refuse. She spent the rest of a long life, quietly earning her own name back, one hostel, one memoir, and one honest marriage at a time, on her own schedule, rather than her mother's. That, more than any palace, any title, or any jewel the Duke ever purchased with her money, is the part of this story that is actually worth remembering. The tiara survives behind museum glass. The palace survives behind its ticket gates. What very nearly did not survive was the woman herself, and it is her survival, not the stonework, that the story was always actually about. Somewhere in the crowd outside St. Thomas Church on that November afternoon, nobody watching the carriages could have guessed at any of this. They saw a duke, a fortune, a bride weeping what most assumed were tears of joy. Nobody in that crowd was thinking about the woman underneath the veil at all, only about the wedding she represented, the alliance of money and rank that New York's papers would spend the following week describing in exhaustive, admiring detail. It took her the better part of a lifetime and a book written in her own hand to make sure that was no longer true. She did not get to choose how her story began. She spent every year afterward making absolutely certain she chose how it would end. If her story moved you the way it moved us putting this one together, stay with us a little longer. There are dozens more women like her waiting in the description of this channel, heiresses and duchesses and forgotten wives whose fortunes quietly built a world other people ended up getting credit for. Women whose names rarely make it into the guidebooks, even when their money kept the roof over the whole building. Subscribe, ring the notification bell so the next one finds you, and tell us in the comments below whose story from tonight you would like us to tell in full. Thank you for spending this hour with Consuelo Vanderbilt. We will see you in the next one.